creation of investment zones in areas which need a helping hand is the right course of action? And does he envisage one in the Borderlands area in the near future?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question. He's been tireless in his advocacy for his constituents. And the areas in England eligible to host an investment zone were identified through a rigorous analytical assessment, which reviewed every place in England and shortlisted based on their strengths in innovation, productivity potential and levelling up need, as well as the strength of local leadership, knowledge assets and sectoral strengths. Now, the Borderlands area that he refers to is already benefiting from the Borderlands growth deal, signed just 2 years ago, worth 452 million, which aims to create 5,500 jobs. But of course, he's also familiar with the recent investment signed off through the Housing Infrastructure Fund for 134 million, leading to 10,325 homes in St Cuthbert's Garden Village.
Jim Shannon.
Mr Speaker, can I thank the Minister very much for that? He mentioned in his introduction, he referred to the 4 zones and 1 for Northern Ireland. Of course, I'm going to make a play for my constituency, Mr Speaker, as everyone would. So what discussions has the Minister had with the department back home in relation to a potential investment zone in my constituency of Strangford, just to ensure that the people there can have the same opportunities as others across all of the United Kingdom? Thank you.
Well, I think the whole House would agree that the honourable gentleman must be the most effective advocate for his constituents, and we will see what happens. There will be a rigorous process, there will be wide consultation, and we expect to have an outcome that will benefit his constituents and across the whole of Northern Ireland.
SNP spokesperson Stuart Hosey.
Mr Speaker, looking at the incentives for the investment zones, 100% business rates relief, enhanced capital allowances, with the exception of reduced NI contributions, it's hard to see the difference between an investment zone and what was offered for enterprise zones. So what additional fiscal support is the government providing to differentiate these investment zones from enterprise zones?
Well, the key distinction is that we've identified areas that have cluster, often related to a university, have potential in a key sector. And this will be worth 18 million over areas that have cluster, often related to a university, have potential in a key sector. And this will be worth 18 million over 5 years. And obviously, we're working very closely with partners. It's difficult to be precise on the numbers because obviously there will be bespoke collaborations according to which sectors are involved.
Sure.
Can I thank the Minister for that answer? But of course, enterprise zones and indeed their near cousin, the Freeport, also would speak about clusters in the same kind of language. So what steps are the government taking to ensure the investment zones don't suffer from the same problem that enterprise zones and free ports suffered from, which was a woeful failure to deliver the number of permanent, good quality jobs which were initially promised?
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
Approach that I referred to. We will be working closely with DLUC to look at each proposal by the end of the year. And having that certainty over the tax incentives over those 5 years, making local authorities an accountable body for the delivery of it. But I think he would agree. In fact, his whole political doctrine is about the distinctions that exist in different communities around the United Kingdom. And that's where we have a variety of interventions designed to make an effective impact in different places across the United Kingdom.
Number 2, Mr Speaker.
Thank you. The Chancellor has regular discussions with Cabinet colleagues on a range of issues. Autumn Statement 2022 provided an additional 2.3 billion in funding for schools this year and next, over and above totals announced at the spending review in 2021. This means school funding next year will be 58.8 billion, exceeding 2010 levels of per pupil funding in real terms. And this will help schools to manage costs, including the costs of school meals.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Since Liberal Democrats in government rolled out universal infant free school meals in 2014, funding for them has increased by just 11 pence. This is seeing with face, or will the Minister continue to leave our schools and children shortchanged?
Well, I don't quite agree with that analysis. I mean, the free school meals funding for 23-24 was set in line with precedent every year, using inflation forecasts at the time in the autumn prior. And around 1.9 million pupils are claiming a free school meal at lunchtime, and that equates to 22.5% of pupils in state-funded schools. So together with the 1.25 million infants supported through universal infant free school meal policy, it is having an impact. But I recognise the pressures across the whole of the economy, and that's why, as I said, the government gave those additional funds in the autumn statement last year.
Bob Blackman.
Number 3, Speaker.
The Edinburgh reforms take forward the government's ambition to maintain the UK's position as a world-leading global financial centre, whilst ensuring our financial sector remains robust in the face of market shocks. In particular, they introduce a new secondary duty of growth and international competitiveness, a first for UK regulators.
Bob Blackman.
Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for that answer. Clearly, the culture and performance of regulators is one of the key considerations that firms have when they choose to invest in the UK. What steps is he going to take to introduce key performance indicators for financial regulators to report on their delivery against the new growth and competitive objective in the Financial Services and Markets Bill? And is he considering any additional measures to add to the bill which would strengthen the independent scrutiny of regulators?
Well, my honourable friend does great service as chair of the all-party group on personal banking and fairer financial services, so he knows of what he speaks. The government today published a call for proposals on the metrics that regulators should publish to support scrutiny of their work. As every business leader knows, what gets measured gets managed. And that responds to the significant interest shown by industry and Parliament in ensuring that there are appropriate and transparent public measures to support scrutiny of the regulator's performance. The government is clear that with great power must come greater accountability.
Gareth Thomas.
One measure that would improve the regulatory framework for mutuals in the financial services sector, such as Royal London or Liverpool Victoria, would be the introduction of permanent mutual shares. Given that such a reform would allow a new safe route to access the capital that such financial mutuals need to expand, and without having to demutualise as well, could the Minister explain why the Treasury is still dragging its feet on the introduction of such a significant reform?
Well, as the honourable gentleman and myself have talked a number of times, the Treasury, I don't think it's fair to say the Treasury is dragging its feet. We've supported reform to the mutual sector. We welcome a diversity of provision, and that involves a greater expansion and more commercial freedom for the mutual sector. We're looking at with the Law Commission on taking their work forward to see if we can help. And I'm always happy to sit down with the honourable gentleman or with any representatives from the sector as part of my widespread programme of engagement.
Christine Jardine.
Question number 4, please, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Energy Bills discount scheme will provide all eligible businesses and other non-domestic energy users with a discount on high energy bills for 12 months from the 1st of April 2023 to the 31st of March 2024. It will also provide businesses in sectors with particularly high levels of energy use and trade intensity with a high level of support. The scheme will help those locked into contracts signed before recent significant falls in the wholesale price manage their costs and provide others with reassurance against the risk of prices rising again.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much. In my constituency of Edinburgh West, however, just this past week, speaking to businesses, they are not finding that the help is there that they need, that the combination of the cost of living crisis and energy costs and business rates is pushing them towards a crisis. The Federation of Small Businesses estimates that 93,000 small businesses could go out of business this year because of high energy costs. So does the government accept that more is going to have to be done, particularly to help small companies renegotiate tariffs? And can they tell me what they intend to do about that?
Well, the Honourable Lady raises an incredibly important point, and this government is very alive to the issues that businesses face across the country. Last year, she'll be aware that the EBRS was unprecedented in its nature and scale, and the government was always clear that that was going to be time limited and intended as a bridge for businesses as wholesale gas prices come down. They have now come down quite significantly, but we do have the EBDS, which strikes the right balance between supporting businesses for another year, but also limiting the taxpayers' exposure to volatile energy prices.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Treasury was quick to act during the pandemic when hoteliers in Aberconwy told me that banks were directing them to their premium lending products instead of the government C-bills. And now those same hoteliers are telling me that the energy supply market seems to have failed. They're seeing their bills tripling just as market rates drop below government support levels. They fear that the supplier's thumb is on their side of the scales. Now, none of this will be new to the Minister, so can he tell me what he's doing, please? And can he also meet with myself and market and sector representatives to make sure that some common sense is brought back to energy supply contracts?
Well, my honourable friend is a great champion of businesses in his constituency. In the first instance, I would advise businesses to always contact suppliers to discuss their contracts. We are alive to the issue that some businesses are having difficulty securing the benefit of falling wholesale prices from their energy suppliers. The Chancellor wrote to Ofgem, who oversee the energy market for consumers, in January, and Ofgem have now launched an investigation into the non-domestic energy market. We await their conclusions, and at that point, I'd be very happy to meet with the honourable gentleman.
The poll bill.
5, sir.
Minister.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to answer this question together with questions 9 and 11. The government's 3 economic priorities this year are to halve inflation, grow the economy and get debt falling. This will require patience and discipline. Countries around the world are facing rising prices and we won't be able to make this go away overnight. But by sticking to our plan, we will halve inflation this year and help to ease the pressures that people are facing.
Price inflation is increasing far faster than the overall average increase in prices. And this is affecting the poorest, the hardest in Kettering and across the country. Is there any good news at all from His Majesty's Treasury about the prospects for food price inflation over the next 12 months?
Speaker, my honourable friend is a doughty champion for his constituents. The OBR this year does expect food, tobacco and alcohol inflation to fall significantly. But that's not all. The government recognises the challenges facing households due to the elevated costs of living in general, including food. So we took action at the Spring Statement to support struggling families. Taken together with previous action, support to households to help with bills is worth an average of £3,300 a year across this year and next.
French.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government are absolutely right to prioritise reducing inflation, given the significant impact this is having on families and businesses across the country. And I welcome the support the Minister has outlined for families in my constituency of Old Bexley and Sidcup. But can my honourable friend confirm what assessment has been made by the Treasury into the impact of over a decade of abnormal monetary policy following the global financial crisis?
As my honourable friend knows, monetary policy is the responsibility of the Independent Monetary Policy Committee and the Bank of England. We'll continue to work closely with them to ensure that monetary and fiscal policy are well coordinated. The Chancellor reconfirmed the inflation target of 2% at the autumn statement and confirmed this government will not change the target.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst inflation is now heading in the right direction, the effect of these price rises is still being felt by File's older people. What steps is my honourable friend taking? What conversations has he had with the DWP in order to make sure that File's retired residents are being well protected?
Mr. Speaker, I and my colleagues work closely with colleagues in the Department of Work and Pension. As my honourable friend knows, on behalf of pensioners in Filed, more than 8 million pensioner households will receive a cost of living payment of £300 this winter, but more than 12 million pensioners have benefited from a 10.1% increase to their state pension. That's the biggest percentage rise in the state pension for over 30 years and its biggest ever cash increase.
Mr. McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Minister rightly said, monetary policy is made independently by the Monetary Policy Committee in this country, but the government is responsible for economic stability, and for that we need investment. So can I ask the Minister, what policies of the past couple of years does the Minister believe has got us into this position with inflation, and how is the government going to make sure that we have better economic stability going forward, given their recent record?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, of course, the Honourable Lady omits to mention both the headwinds from the global pandemic and Russia's aggression in Ukraine. And any financially literate conversation on this subject has to acknowledge that we're seeing very similar rates of increase in inflation and rising interest rates across the developed world. In that context, this government is focusing on stability, ensuring that we continue to pay down debt over the cycle, and not, Mr. Speaker, do what the previous Labour government did and leave a note behind for their successors saying that there is no money left.
Listen through this. I listen through this.
Oh. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I couldn't quite hear you over the chatter. Food price inflation is standing at 19.2% in March, up from February, and this is causing severe problems for many of my constituents, particularly those who have no recourse to public fund status, meaning that they are not entitled to any support from the government whatsoever. What's he going to do to help those people really struggling and heading to the food banks because they can't afford to make ends meet?
Mr. Speaker, in the interest of time, I won't repeat for the Honourable Lady the support for households, which averages 3,500 people across the United Kingdom. If the Honourable Lady has constituents who have particular needs, the government has recently extended the £1 billion Household Support Fund, and I suggest she works with her local authority to try and meet their needs through that.
Mr. Speaker. Inflation, of course, isn't just hitting individuals and families, it's also hitting councils and potentially infrastructure projects. Lodge Hill Junction on the A34 in Abingdon is one such key piece of local infrastructure that, when completed, will support jobs and housing across Oxfordshire, Science Vale and MHC and the economy as a whole. Homes England and MHCLG say the final piece of this funding now sits with the Treasury in the Brownfield Infrastructure and Land Fund. So would the Minister meet with me so that I can explain why this is such an important piece of funding to be released, and please can the government not be the last piece of this puzzle so that we can deliver Lodge Hill Junction once and...
It's absolutely nothing to do with the question. It's a bit of a struggle, isn't it, between... Do you think you can answer it? No. OK, Paul in there.
Question number 6, sir.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as the Minister responsible for His Majesty's Revenue and Customs, may I wish His Majesty the King and Her Majesty the Queen a very long and successful reign, and the 63,000 members of staff who work for HMRC will be proud to try to help His Majesty's Revenue and Customs, as they are bound to do. The Government is aware of concerns about employment practices in the hair and beauty sector. These concerns are largely focused on the so-called rent-a-chair model, which is a long-standing practice and a legitimate alternative to employing stylists, provided the parties involved follow the relevant rules. The Government is committed to tackling disguised employment, and HMRC will consider any evidence suggesting businesses have misclassified individuals for tax purposes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Minister for her answer. It's estimated that 70% of the hairdressing industry is currently operating under a self-employed model to avoid PAYE, national insurance and VAT. According to HMRC guidelines, these salons often amount to disguised employment. The problem is that all apprentices, and 90% of hairdressers learn through apprenticeships, must be trained in salons that pay their tax, an increasingly unattractive model. Would the Minister consider how we can taper VAT rates or enforce disguised employment rules more stringently in order to ensure that we have appropriately trained hairdressers in the future?
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure I am joined by all members of the House for thanking my honourable friend for her interest in ensuring that we have hairdressers in 15 years' time. We recognise the important role that hairdressing salons play in the education and training of apprenticeships, and indeed funding for employer-led apprenticeships will grow to £2.7 billion in 2024-25, which will help to pay for the cost of training and assessment. However, she is quite right to pinpoint the need for those participating in the industry of hairdressing to ensure they are following the rules correctly. It is not their choice. There are very strict criteria and they must make sure that they follow it. But I very much look forward to discussing this in further detail with my honourable friend later this week or next week.
Well, Farrell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The hair and beauty industry is characterised by a high percentage of female entrepreneurs and young people. However, that workforce continues to be at risk of disguised employment. What steps are ministers taking to ensure that self-employed individuals are aware of their tax expectations so that women and young people can continue to thrive in this sector?
Wonderful that we have so many women setting up their own businesses and taking that step into entrepreneurship. She's absolutely right, though, to ensure that, I don't know, there's chuntering opposite, they seem to be disagreeing with this. She's right to ensure, though, that we help entrepreneurs, whether male or female, to understand the rules when it comes to tax. And so this is why we provide guidance and support for customers to help them understand employment status, and we have agreed guidelines specifically with the National Federation of Hairdressers to help them communicate with their industry as to which rules apply to which hairdressers.
Alexander Stafford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with your permission, I would like to answer this question together with question number 15. The government is taking action to protect struggling families by providing support to households to help with higher bills worth £3,300 per household on average over this year and last. This includes targeted support to the most vulnerable in our society through additional cost of living payments and the uprating of benefits by 10.1% this year. The government has also increased the national living wage by 9.7%, representing an increase of over £1,600, the annual earnings of a full-time worker on the national living wage.
Alexander Stafford.
Thank my honourable friend for that answer, but does he also agree with me that the best support for the cost of living, beyond the £94 billion this government has already spent, is by cutting inflation to ease pressure, especially on food, fuel and energy for families in Rother Valley and up and down the country?
Absolutely agree with my honourable friend, and the government is doing three things to reduce inflation. We're remaining steadfast in supporting the independent MPC at the Bank of England as they continue to take action to return inflation to target. We're making responsible decisions on tax and spending, so we're not adding fuel to the fire. And third, we're tackling high energy prices by holding down energy bills for households and businesses alongside investing in long-term energy security.
David Simmons.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Lowest income households in my constituency are the biggest beneficiaries of a strong economy. So does my right honourable friend agree that reducing debt, reducing inflation and balancing the books are the most effective government interventions to support low-income households?
Absolutely, I agree with my honourable friend. It's right that we continue to support the cost of living challenges, the energy price guarantee I've mentioned, but also sticking to that plan to avoid unnecessary inflationary pressure. On average this year, as a result of government decisions made from Autumn Statement 20...
Order. We're going to have to carry this on at another time. Carry on. Sorry, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a result of government decisions made from Autumn Statement 22 onwards, households in the bottom half of the income distribution will see twice as much benefit from government support as households in the top half of the income distribution in cash terms.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I listened with interest to the answer the Minister gave about support for households, but it doesn't match up with the reality in Rotherham, where constituents have had increases in rent, in mortgage, in fuel, in food and cuts to public services. So what is he actually going to do to deliver the support we need to make ends meet? Because the offers on the table are not cutting it.
Well, I think everyone can see that the government's made a range of interventions over the last 2 years, and that means support for all of those on means-tested benefits. That's 8 million people. 8 million pensioner households will also benefit from the non-discretionary payments effectively. And then the Household Support Fund, which we repeated, put another £1 billion to give local authorities that discretion to, in individual circumstances, to add supplementary support. Of course, I recognise that this is an incredibly challenging time for the most vulnerable, but we've tried to target those interventions to the most vulnerable, listen to the Low Pay Commission, increase the national living wage as well to £10.42, but recognising that these are difficult times, but we will get through them.
Number 8, please, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I should like to answer this question along with question 20. It is right that everyone contributes to sustainable public finances, and the government is ensuring that those with the broadest shoulders pay their fair share. Spring Budget took steps to tackle avoidance and to improve HMRC's ability to collect tax debts. This comes alongside taking millions out of paying tax altogether by consistently raising personal tax allowances and, of course, an average of over £3,300 of assistance per household in the UK for help with the cost of living over this year and last.
Daniel Zang.
Last week, energy companies announced record profits, some £60 million a day from North Sea oil and gas. Today, the Mirror reports that some 2 million people last month were unable to pay a bill. So why on earth doesn't the government close those huge, huge holes in the levy on North Sea oil and gas profits and actually get that money to the people who need it?
I think the honourable gentleman is being quite fair in he neglects to tell the House the actual rate of levy that these companies are raising. He will understand as well why it is that we have said to businesses that want to invest to improve energy security here in the United Kingdom that we will support such investment. That has to be in our interest because, as we've heard only today, the concerns rightly raised by members of Parliament on behalf of their constituents about the cost of living and the impact particularly of energy prices.
Richard Burke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government recently announced a huge tax giveaway to the very wealthiest, allowing them to stash away vast sums in their pensions tax-free. The £1 billion annual cost for that handout would cover the cost of free school meals. When food banks gave out 1 million food parcels for children last year, why does the government think that this tax cut for the super rich is a priority?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I gently remind him of the conversation that happened around budget, I hope he recalls, about the need to get doctors, consultants and those in the public sector back into the NHS, because we heard from the doctors themselves, the BMA and others, that there were barriers in the pension tax rules at that point stopping them from continuing to serve. I am delighted if these rules help more doctors to serve our NHS, to help our constituents who are patients, and to help them continue serving this vital public service. The difference between the Conservatives on this side of the House and the honourable gentleman opposite is that we listen to people and we deliver on what we need to keep this economy going and to help our NHS.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the best ways we can ensure fairness in the tax system is to let people keep more of their hard-earned money. The Prime Minister last summer outlined a plan to see the basic rate of income tax cut to 15p in the pound by the end of the decade. Can the Minister let me know when we will see that plan outlined in detail?
Well, I do hope the honourable gentleman has been listening both to the Chancellor at Spring Budget, but also speeches and so on since then from my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, about the need for fiscal responsibility. We have to be fiscally responsible. We have acknowledged that. We've had to also make some very, very difficult decisions along the way. But we are clear that with halving inflation, tackling our debt and growing the economy, that is what will enable us to make the sorts of tax cuts that he and I both want to see so very much.
Mr. Jamesbury.
Mr. Speaker, tens of thousands of people have been affected by the loan charge, with some having faced well-documented distress and harm as a result of HMRC's approach. Yet at the same time, HMRC has been issuing fewer than 2 fines a year against the architects and enablers of failed tax avoidance schemes. It is absolutely right that the disguised remuneration schemes are tackled fairly and effectively, so how on earth can the Conservative government justify such a light-touch approach for the promoters of such schemes, whilst many of those caught up in them face such a nightmare?
Well, I would draw the honourable gentleman's attentions to the strengthening of HMRC's powers to tackle promoters of tax avoidance in both of the previous Finance Act 21 and 22, with a further tough new package of measures to ensure promoters face stronger sanctions much more quickly. These measures will raise £130 million over the next 5 years and, in fact, are already being used. And we have already published the details of promoters and tax avoidance schemes in order to help consumers. And we have also published HMRC stop notices, because we understand we want to help taxpayers who want to do the right thing to understand which promoters and so on should be avoided.
Alex Cunningham.
Number 10, please.
Minister.
Compared to the G7, the UK had the highest rate of growth in each of the last 2 years. The IMF UK growth forecast for 2023 has been upgraded by more than any other G7 country, and the IMF has said that the UK is on the right track for economic growth.
Alex Cunningham.
Mr. Speaker, but the British people want hope for the future, but all they see is Britain continually lagging behind on the global stage, with prospects for their families getting worse. The IMF says that Britain will have a smaller economy by the end of the year, the poorest growth of the G7 over this year and next. In March, UK inflation was the highest in Western Europe, and projections show that it will be highest in the G7 this year. And food prices are rising 50% faster than in the G7. Whose fault is it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's certainly the honourable gentleman's fault if, having asked if we would do an assessment of performance across the G7, and we do precisely that, he doesn't like the answer, because the reality is that across the G7, growth has fallen and inflation has risen. But we know, Mr. Speaker, the sources of those, and it's not this government, it's the fault of Putin and the global COVID pandemic, whether they like it or not.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend is right to ignore the gloom and negativity coming from the benches opposite. They'll always find a reason to talk down the British economy, because isn't it the case that today, with more people in our country going out to work than ever before, the truth is our economy is demonstrating a dynamism and resilience that few other economies around the world can emulate, and a dynamism that you don't get with the Labour government.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and not just dynamism, but I think resilience is a strong word. And thanks to the actions that this government has taken over the last 6 months, the OBR has confirmed the UK is expected to now avoid a recession this year.
Kirsten Oswald.
Question number 12, please, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you. With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to answer this question with question number 17. The UK has grown faster than France and at a similar rate to Germany since leaving the single market. It remains challenging to separate the effects of Brexit and wider global trends on the UK economy, such as the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, adding pressures to trade, prices and the wider economy. We are continuing to support businesses trading with the EU, as well as helping them seize new opportunities with fast-growing economies around the world, including our free trade agreement negotiations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and happy Europe Day. In recent months, we've seen tech companies attack Brexit. The world-leading chip company, ARM, opted to only float stock in the US because of how bad a place the UK is to do business. So we have culture, tourism, the NHS and now tech all suffering because of Brexit. I wonder how grateful the Minister feels that the Leader of the Opposition dropped his and his party's principles and they're still supporting this costly Brexit.
Crikey, I'm going to leave it all to the Leader of the Opposition to flip-flop his way through that particular policy. What I can tell her is that we are the best place to invest in tech in Europe. We are only the third economy in the world with a $1 trillion tech sector. We are ranked as the world's fourth most innovative economy, and we have created more unicorns than France and Germany combined.
Patrick Grady.
Yes, well, unicorns and fantasies are largely what we hear from the government benches these days. The reality is that the Music Venue Trust reckons grassroots venues are closing at a rate of 1 per week. Bands from Europe find it increasingly difficult to travel here, and the hospitality sector more generally is experiencing catastrophic staff shortages. Isn't Lord Heselton right when he says that Brexit has been a classic mistake, a terrible, horrible miscalculation, and the elephant in the room of our present economic difficulties?
Absolutely. Hear, hear. I'm interested that the honourable gentleman dismisses these incredibly successful unicorn start-ups in the UK economy. I hope that he will not dismiss their continuing success as we continue to support them through the various tax reliefs we are offering them and investment, including through our most recent research and development tax reliefs. But I would also point out to him that, of course, Scotland itself will benefit from some 73 trade deals secured with non-EU countries, which include control of our fishing waters, something I know is a matter of great concern to Scottish residents.
We now come to Shadow Minister Pat McFadden.
Speaker, I'm never quite clear why, if we don't like trade barriers, the answer is to erect even more of them. But through the retained EU law bill, the government said it would get rid of 4,000 laws built up during our time in the EU. The Prime Minister even got his shredder out to show us what this would look like, and the government said there would be a sunset clause to make sure all this happened by the end of the year. Now, voices from both business and the trade unions have said that this could cause even more chaos and uncertainty and undermine workers' rights in breach of the promises made by ministers opposite at the time of the referendum. So after marching the troops up to the top of the hill and getting the backbenchers very excited, can the Minister confirm, is the government keeping the sunset clause to have all this done by the end of the year?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't know if I can speak on behalf of the Secretary of State for Business and Trade, who is the portfolio holder for that piece of legislation. What I do know is that the bill is currently before the House of Lords and will no doubt be scrutinised very carefully by their lordships. But what I can also reassure the House is that we are taking a careful and considered approach to the benefits, the regulations, the laws that Brexit presents to us. And we know from our discussions with businesses that business certainty is something that we all want to strive for and achieve. And I'm sure once this bill has been scrutinised by the House of Lords, members opposite...
I've got another question to come. Don't worry, you've got another chance. Back, McFadden.
Thank you, Mr. I think business certainty might be improved by an answer to the question. Mr. Speaker, inflation is 10%, the highest in the G7, and food inflation is 19%. The former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Member for Uxbridge and South Ruislip, to avoid confusion, because there are a few former Prime Ministers, promised us there will be no non-tariff barriers to trade. But we already know that many small businesses are giving up exporting to the EU altogether because of costs and delays. And now, with inflation already at these levels, this is the moment the government has picked to impose a new system for checks on EU goods, estimated to add £400 million a year to the cost of goods coming into the UK. Can the Minister tell us, why is the government picking this moment of all moments to add these new costs and price rises to UK consumers who are already struggling to make ends meet because of the biggest cost of living crisis in decades?
Mr. Speaker, just to clarify, I was being respectful of not just this House, but the right of the House, the other House, to scrutinise legislation. I hope he would agree with that as a fine parliamentarian, as I know he is. But in terms of business certainty, what we are seeking to achieve through this legislation, but also importantly the measures that we are setting out through the Windsor framework and the arrangements at borders, is to give business exactly the certainty they need after Brexit. I think we all accept that leaving the European Union, leaving the single market, that was a generational change, a seismic change in how we wish to do business. But unlike the party opposite, we believe in Brexit, we believe in the opportunities that Brexit can provide our businesses, and that is why we are taking these measures through very, very carefully and considerately with businesses.
Afzal Khan.
Question 13, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with your permission, I should like to answer this question together with question 24. As Minister for Public Spending, I oversee the government's budgeting system, and a key element of this is incentivising departments to manage spending effectively so that value for taxpayers' money is maximised. And that's why the government launched an efficiency and savings review at Autumn Statement 22, and through the review, departments reprioritised and identified further efficiencies building on the 5% efficiency challenge set out at the Spending Review 21 to better deliver value for money for the taxpayer.
Afzal Khan.
Mr. Speaker, when the Chancellor, the now Prime Minister, spent £1.3 million of public money on focus groups, including asking what the public think of him. Following the public's resounding rejection of the Tories in the last week's elections, and we now know what the public think of him. So will the government stop wasting taxpayers' money to boost the Prime Minister's ego and do the right thing and call a general election?
No.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. £7.9 billion was wasted on useless and overpriced PPE. Meanwhile, opportunists who saw the Tories coming are now profiteering on the back of the public purse. Does the Minister regret that this money was not spent wisely? Nearly £8 billion could buy us 20 new hospitals.
Thank the honourable gentleman for his question. Our priority was clear throughout the COVID crisis, and that was to get PPE to the front line as quickly as possible. And due diligence was carried out on all companies that referred to the department. And obviously, despite all those steps being taken, some instances of fraud did occur, with unscrupulous suppliers taking advantage of the situation. This government takes that fraud seriously, and DHSC are exploring every available option to bring those who commit fraud to account. We've also made another number of other interventions, including investment in the Taxpayer Protection Task Force, to normalise higher compliance activity in HMRC, alongside other measures to deal with fraud elsewhere in some of the emergency schemes that we set up to help this economy and this country get through COVID.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the Public Accounts Committee revealed that our country lost £9 billion worth of tax revenue during the pandemic because HMRC redeployed 4,000 staff members whose jobs were to chase down tax avoiders. Now, the Prime Minister was Chancellor at the time and presumably signed off this decision. So could I ask the Minister, did the Prime Minister do this as a deliberate act to give the green light to tax avoiders, or is this just another example of Tory incompetence?
Well, I think that's quite a ridiculous suggestion, to be honest. I mean, the HMRC received £863 million to modernise the tax system, and that included 136 investment over the spending period to deliver improvements in terms of a single customer record and act. Now, in terms of what happened over COVID, I've already set out the investment that we made, £100 million on Taxpayer Protection Task Force. We take fraud very seriously. And obviously now it's about HMRC looking at financial records of excessive trading to come to terms with those businesses that did use some of those schemes fraudulently, and we will continue to work on that.
We now come to topicals. Colin Lockhart. Not here. Ashley Dalton.
Number 2, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, 3 of the Prime Minister's 5 priorities are economic priorities to halve inflation this year, grow the economy and reduce debt. We're on track to halve inflation this year to ease the cost of living. We've taken the difficult but responsible decision needed to get debt falling and secure the future of public services. And we have a clear plan to grow the economy, to create better paid jobs and opportunity right across the country.
Dalton.
The Consumer Voice organisation, which has recently found that 2 million UK households missed a key payment for their mortgage, a rent loan or credit card last month alone. 700,000 of these related to housing. So when will the Tory government wake up to the fact that the cost of living crisis is far from over, and what does it intend to do about it?
Very good, Ashley.
Well, I think in previous answers, I've set out a number of interventions the government has taken to help the most vulnerable. I've mentioned the Household Support Fund, the benefits that accrue to all those who are on means-tested benefit, particularly pensioner households, those who are eligible for disability benefit. As I also said, the money that the government has made available is designed to focus on those who are most in need. And we will continue to look out for the most vulnerable through this difficult time.
Mr. Speaker, does my right honourable friend agree with me that fiscal responsibility is vital if we are to cut inflation and grow the economy? And does he also agree that the Labour Party's £90 billion of unfunded spending commitments would put all of that at risk, with higher taxes and more borrowing the inevitable result?
I couldn't agree with the honourable gentleman more. Responsible public spending is at the core of getting our economy into a state where it can grow. And the £90 billion of unfunded spending pledges made by members opposite will be scrutinised very carefully, I'm sure, by many in the months ahead.
So the Chancellor Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Conservatives have now had 13 years in office. Wages lower, the weekly food shop astronomical, energy bills unprecedented, 24 Tory tax rises, and the national debt has ballooned. So can I ask, after 13 years of Conservative government, does the Minister think that people feel better off or worse off?
What I can tell the Right Honourable Lady is that since 2010, 25% increase in the real take-home pay for workers on the national living wage, increasing recently the national living wage to £10.42 an hour, a 9.7% increase for those over the age of 23. When we came into power in 2009-10, there was a deficit of £158 billion. Before we got into COVID, it was down to £38 billion. We have gone through the most tremendous challenges that this country has seen for about 100 years. I think most people in this country understand that this government has acted on the challenges we've faced in office.
Rachel Reeves.
Mr. Speaker, they've had 13 years, and the answer to the question, do people feel better off, is a resounding no. This morning, I met with 22 newly elected council leaders from the Labour Party, who are themselves creating emergency plans to help tackle the cost of living crisis in their communities. Why won't the Conservative government play their part, do the right thing, close the loopholes in their oil and gas tax, and help working people in Britain, as a Labour government would do?
Well, I congratulate those successful across the country in last week's elections. But what I would also say is that what business leaders want and what the country wants is steady policy making, delivering growth in the economy, dealing with the biggest scourge on the economy, which is inflation. The Right Honourable Lady says from a sedentary position that we've had 13 years. We've also spent £400 billion where we had a global pandemic, and when we came out of it, where we had to shut down the economy. When we came out of it, we had high inflation consequential of a war that we hadn't had in Europe for over 70 years. Those are the realities, and that's what this government has responded to.
Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Regenerating our town centres was a key part of the local election campaign in Torbay. Would my right honourable friend meet me, my honourable friend for Totnes, and the new leadership of Torbay Council to discuss what further fiscal steps can be taken to support these aims?
I'm always very happy to meet my honourable friend. I would like to congratulate him on his leadership of his council candidates last week and the excellent result that he secured. And of course, we've invested in many coastal communities across the country. And I'm very keen to discuss specifics around how the government can support him as he drives that local constituency and economy forward.
John Warren.
Mr. Speaker, today, manufacturing body Make UK warned the government that to tackle regional inequalities and compete on a national stage, we need a national industrial strategy as a matter of urgency. Do the ministers recognise that the reason that wages in the North East are falling under the Tories is their lack of an industrial strategy and their failure to follow Labour's example and commit to a modern industrial strategy that invests in the industries of the future and delivers good quality jobs across our country?
No, I don't recognise that characterisation. What I recognise is a government that's determined to see the economy grow. I see investment in investment zones focused in her region, working with the excellent universities that she's familiar with. I see a government that's putting 100 million into Foundation Models Task Force, 900 million to invest in supercomputer, to fund AI, and a quantum strategy which is generally seen as world leading, as well as 160 million of investment in the tech sector. So this is a government that is committed to the growth industries of the future.
Jane Hunt.
University Hospitals of Leicester was pleased to hear that they are to receive £400 million for a new hospital, but I understand the money is still with the Treasury. Please can my honourable friend confirm that when UHL will receive their £400 million, and whether it might be increased to account for construction cost rises?
I thank the honourable lady for her question. And of course, delivery of new hospital infrastructure and prioritisation within health budgets is a matter for the Department of Health and Social Care. But I know from frequent conversations with the Secretary of State that he's working tirelessly to ensure as many new hospitals as possible and wider improvements to the health estate can occur. And I shall make representations to him after this session.
Well,
thank you. It's reported in the press today that prior to any investment, BP and Equinor sought written guarantees that assets at the Teesworks site hadn't been acquired as a result of, and I quote, an unacceptable act, and that directors, and I quote, will not hide or dissimulate the nature, origin, location, disposition or ownership of assets, rights or values. It's just extraordinary. Given the importance of this free port to investment and jobs in Teesside, can the Treasury confirm if it too has made any similar checks?
I'm very sorry, I can't answer that question, but I'm happy to meet with the honourable gentleman to look at the very serious matter that he's raised and get an answer for him.
Follow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chief Secretary knows that the much long-hidden business case for East West Rail will represent a bad deal for taxpayers. He will know that MPs from across Parliament have written about greener, better alternatives for growth in the Oxcam Arc. And he will know that on Thursday the Conservatives won the mayoralty in Bedford for the first time because the Conservative candidate Tom Wootton called for a review of Bedford Council working and their support for East West Rail. So will my right honourable friend meet with me to discuss this further urgently?
I'd be very happy to meet with him, and I also congratulate the Mayor of his hometown of Bedford for the success that he had last week.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's falling pretty short of where it needs to be if we're actually going to tackle net zero. There was some recent research by E3G and WWF, the Worldwide Fund for Nature, around clean investment. The gap is currently between 81 and 111 billion between now and 2030. That's the equivalent of a quarter of the investment required in this crucial economic sector and every other sector of the economy. Public investment, Mr. Speaker, clearly needs to be a key driver in reaching net zero. So I wonder if the ministers can answer if they will consider increasing the capacity of UK infrastructure banking on that.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the government is leading the way with the recently published Green Finance Strategy, but that stands as part of a broader piece of work, unleashing productive finance into all parts of the economy and, in particular, funding the transition, which is very capital intensive.
Luke Evans.
For 2 weeks ago, meeting with Leicestershire MPs and the senior leadership of the County Council to discuss funding there. Particular concern is around core funding of SEND, social care and transport like buses. So what more can he do to address the County Council funding problems we have in Leicestershire?
Well, I know my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, welcomed that meeting on the 25th of April. The government remains committed to improving the local government finance landscape, and in doing so, the government will work closely with local partners, including Leicestershire, and take stock of the challenges and opportunities across the sector. I'd like to thank him for his deep thinking into how improvements can be made.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Why is the Prime Minister and Government Ministers so keen to protect non-dom status while not investing sufficiently in our NHS as Labour would do?
Well, the honourable gentleman, I hope, knows that we are spending record amounts on the NHS. We are also mindful that non-DOMs pay some £7.9 billion on UK taxes on their UK earnings and have invested some £6 billion since 2012. And so we are mindful of the very, very real impact they make on our revenues. But we have managed to tighten the rules around non-dom status. And Mr. Speaker, that's why.
No, it's not all right. Jonathan Gullis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Day one on the job, and Stoke-on-Trent Labour talked about cancelling the £56 million of levelling up funding, which is UK leading to the great city of Stoke-on-Trent. Will the Chief Secretary of the Treasury confirm the Conservative government is going to have the backs of the people of Stoke-on-Trent and deliver this important levelling up?
We're very committed to the people of Stoke-on-Trent and recognise the enormous investment thanks to his work in campaigning for investment through the Levelling Up Fund, and it's down to the Council now to deliver on that significant investment and make a difference on the ground.
Dave Dougan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The transition to net zero should be the overarching priority for all of us. So, with that in mind, when will the Treasury finally get its act together with the ACON project in the north east of Scotland and accelerate that funding to make sure that the people of the north east of Scotland don't just have to listen to the warm words about a just transition, they can get a job in the just transition?
Well, I think we've made commitments on the first phase, and the Chancellor is considering matters further in terms of the next steps, and he will update the House in due course.
Dave Diana Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, the Financial Times today is reporting that there have been meetings between the Treasury and the Department of Health about compensation for those who were victims of the infected blood inquiry. I wondered whether the Minister might be able to confirm that those meetings have taken place, who was present, and offer reassurance to those who were infected and affected that compensation, as Sir Brian has recommended, will be implemented in full.
I believe the Minister for the Cabinet Office updated the House a couple of weeks ago on this matter, and I'm sure he'll be keen to do so again when those conversations have taken place.
Mr. Speaker, this morning before I left my Livingston constituency, I attended a rally by Hands Off Howden Park and Save Our Pools, two incredible campaigns in my constituency that are trying to protect our arts venues and our pools from closing. Unfortunately, they have been mismanaged by the Labour and Conservative administration. However, there is also the reality to be faced that a decade and a half of austerity has decimated public funding. So when will this government stop wasting money on things like Brexit and nuclear weapons and properly fund our pools and our arts venues?
Well, we don't make decisions typically from Whitehall on specific decisions around local authorities. What we have committed to is significant additional funds for local authorities and funding to Scotland Government through the Barnett formula. I would leave her to continue to lobby and campaign with her constituents to get those decisions made on the ground.
That completes the questions. I'll let the chamber clear before we start the urgent question. Right, we now come to the urgent question. Joanna Chorry.
Mr. Speaker, to ask the Secretary of State for the Home Department if she will make a statement on the policing of protests during the coronation.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the coronation was a once-in-a-generation moment. A moment of national pride. A moment when the eyes of the world were upon us. A ceremony with roots over a millennium old, marking a renewed dedication to service by His Majesty the King in this new reign. Mr. Speaker, the coronation went smoothly and without disruption. I thank the 11,500 police officers on duty, alongside 6,500 military personnel and many civilians. Commissioner Mark Rowley today outlined the intelligence picture in the hours leading up to the coronation. This intelligence picture included more than one plot to cause severe disruption by placing activated rape alarms in the path of horses to induce a stampede, and a separate plot to douse participants in the procession with paint. This was the context, a once-in-a-generation national moment facing specific intelligence threats about multiple, well-organised plots to disrupt it. The police's focus was rightly on ensuring this momentous occasion passed safely and without major disruption. That was successful. All the plots to disrupt the coronation were foiled by a combination of intelligence work and proactive, vigilant policing on the ground. I would like to thank and congratulate the police for this success. At the same time, extensive planning ensured protests could take place. This was also successful. Hundreds of protesters exercised their right to peaceful protest, including a large group numbering in the hundreds in and around Trafalgar Square. Now, where the police reasonably believed they had grounds for arrest, they acted. The latest information is that 64 arrests were made. I won't comment on individual cases or specific decisions, but the arrests included a person wanted for sexual offences, people equipped to commit criminal damage with large quantities of paint, and arrests on suspicion of conspiracy to cause public nuisance, often backed by intelligence. The Met's update last night included regret, to use their word, that 6 people arrested couldn't join the hundreds protesting in Trafalgar Square and nearby. The Met has confirmed those 6 people have now had their bail cancelled with no further action. Mr. Speaker, the police are operationally independent, and for the Met, it is primarily for the Mayor of London to hold them to account. But let's be clear. At the weekend, officers had to make difficult judgments in fast time, in a highly pressured situation against a threatening intelligence picture. I thank the police for doing that, for delivering a successful coronation, and for enabling safe, peaceful protests.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Saturday, millions of people greatly enjoyed the coronation ceremony. Others who wish to see a republic chose to protest peacefully, as is their right in a democratic society. Protests in Glasgow and Edinburgh went off without incident. However, in London, protesters who had gone to considerable lengths to liaise with the Metropolitan Police in advance of their protests and to clear both the nature and the location of the protest were detained, searched, arrested and held in the cells from 7 a.m. till after 11 p.m. All 6 of those arrested have now received letters saying there'll be no further action taken against them. There were a number of other arrests of concern, but because there's no legal proceedings in respect of the 6, and therefore no reason for Parliament not to begin today to address what happened to them, I'm going to focus on them. Graham Smith, the leader of the group Republic, tells me that the arresting police showed absolutely no interest in contacting the liaison team and seemed focused on luggage straps holding placards together, which they said might be used to lock on. The Joint Committee on Human Rights has repeatedly stressed that public authorities, including the police, are under a negative obligation not to interfere with the right to protest unlawfully, and a positive obligation to facilitate peaceful protest. So why did police arrest protesters who'd gone to such great lengths to clear their protest in advance? And why did they do so on grounds which they now admit are not sufficient to charge them and without following up with the liaison team? What do citizens need to do now to clear a protest in advance? On the BBC Radio 4 Today programme, Sir Peter Fahey, the former Chief Constable of Greater Manchester Police, said what had happened has to be seen in the context of media, political and public pressure on the police. He referred to what he called, quotes, some pretty direct and personal feedback brought to bear on Sir Mark Rowley before the Home Affairs Select Committee on 26 April by the Honourable Member for Ashfield, and I have notified him that I had mentioned him, Mr. Speaker. So, was political pressure brought to bear on the police? Sir Peter also said that the legislation, the Public Order Bill and the Policing Act is very poorly defined and far too broad, and that is what opposition MPs warned of, particularly regarding offences like locking on. So will he review the legislation and set up an inquiry into what happened to these 6 citizens on Saturday?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable and learned member for her question. I have the greatest respect for her and will take her questions seriously. She asked about pressure. The police are, of course, operationally independent and make these decisions independently of government. Government ministers did receive briefing, particularly as the intelligence picture escalated in the 24 hours prior to the event. But the Mayor of London also received briefings, as I understand did the Shadow Home Secretary, I believe, on Friday. So there is nothing out of the ordinary in ministers receiving briefings, not least because there is a need to coordinate between the police and other agencies, both security agencies and other civilian agencies as well. In terms of legislation, this House has just debated and scrutinised at some length the legislation, and there is no plans to change that. In relation to the 6 people who were arrested and the question of protest more generally, I will just repeat the point, Mr. Speaker, I made in my initial answer, that I think hundreds of people did exercise their peaceful right to protest. It was done, as the Honourable and Learned Lady said, following engagement with the Republic protest group in advance, and the fact that hundreds of people were able to peacefully protest, I think, is testament to the rights of peaceful protest. In relation to those 6 people, I don't want to get into the details of that because, frankly, neither she nor I have all the facts, but clearly, at the point the arrest was made, the police reasonably believed there were grounds to do so. But I emphasise again, for hundreds, I think several hundreds of people on that day, they were able to peacefully protest, as is their absolute right.
David Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Nobody should question that this was a difficult time for the Metropolitan Police, a difficult task to achieve. And nobody should question that, in a large respect, they carried it out brilliantly and gave us a marvellous occasion this weekend. That being said, within 1 week of the Public Order Bill entering the law and in its first serious use, we end up with the head of the Met having to apologise to people who were wrongfully arrested. In the event that, let us say, the Home Affairs Select Committee reviews this matter and comes back with recommendations as to how we change guidelines and maybe laws, will the Home Office take it on board?
Well, I would just caution my right honourable friend against asserting these people were wrongfully arrested. That is not an assertion that has been. That is a legal threshold, and I don't think it's been established that that legal threshold has been met. I would also, in terms of testing this legislation, I would also just draw the House's attention to the fact this was a once-in-a-lifetime event, and it took place against an intelligence backdrop which suggested there were multiple well-organised plots to cause very serious disruption, which, if they had proceeded, would have been taken very seriously by this House and been seen around the world. So I don't think one can infer from what happened at the weekend that the recently passed legislation is defective.
Now comes Shadow Minister Sarah Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The coronation of King Charles III involved the largest police effort ever undertaken. I want to thank the thousands of police officers who ensured so many people were able to enjoy such a historic occasion without incident. Rightly, in our democracy, those police had operational responsibility and had to take decisions at pace and under pressure. And rightly, in our democracy, we also have scrutiny and accountability where problems arise. Hundreds of people who chose to do so were able to protest, and as the Minister stated, some plans to disrupt were foiled. But serious concerns have been raised about some of the arrests. The 6 people from Republic were arrested under new powers in the Public Order Act, being equipped for locking on, which came into force 2 days before the coronation. They have now been released with no further action, and the Met has expressed regret. Mr. Speaker, the Minister knows that I have warned him and his colleagues repeatedly that this new power means that people might be arrested for the wrong thing, carrying a bike lock in their bag, or, as happened in this case, some luggage straps. Many former police officers have warned that these powers put the police in a difficult position and risk undermining the notion of policing by consent. These arrests raise questions that we do want answers to. Why the arresting officers didn't know or take account that Republic had been working with the police, or why they were held for 16 hours. Does the Minister support the review by the Mayor of London so Parliament can see lessons to be learnt? And on the new public order powers, will he ask the Inspectorate and the College of Policing to monitor and review them and report back to Parliament? And will he support the recommendations in the Inspector's report for more specific training for our officers on public order? This weekend was a celebration, and one that could not have happened without the dedication of our police service. But just as important to our British democracy as our constitutional monarchy is our historic model of policing by consent, trust, and our freedom to peacefully protest. It is our job as members of Parliament to come up with laws that solve problems, not create them. So I urge the Minister opposite to learn the lessons and take responsibility for protecting that careful balance between the police and the people.
Well, look, I think it is important to maintain the balance as the Shadow Minister sets out. But as I pointed out in my opening response and my subsequent one to the honourable member opposite, the right to protest was, for those hundreds of people, protected. The protests did happen. And indeed, there is no question in principle or in any legislation that the right to peaceful protest is sacrosanct. We have, of course, in recent months seen that right to peaceful protest being stretched into acts that are deliberately disruptive, where people have sought to close down the M25, they've sought to close down the streets of London, not so much as an act of protest, but to deliberately inconvenience the public, and that is where we draw the line. At the weekend, that is broadly the same test that was being applied. Peaceful protest, of course, absolutely fine. Activity that was designed to seriously disrupt the coronation, including potentially causing a stampede of horses or covering the ceremonial procession in paint, was not acceptable. The police had to make difficult judgment. This is a unique situation. I think it probably can agree it is pretty unique. They had to make very difficult decisions in very fast time against an extremely threatening intelligence picture. Often the facts were, at the time, unclear. That is very difficult. I think all of us here should just accept those are difficult decisions. And I think the police, obviously, it's for them to answer operationally, but they, if they were here, would say they acted lawfully to the best of their reasonable belief at the time. But I do want to put on record the right to peaceful protest is sacrosanct, and I'm sure no one in this House on either side would ever seek to undermine it.
Michael Ellis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Would the Minister agree with me that as a matter of law, the fact of the matter is that the police are entirely within their rights to arrest individuals to prevent a crime? It happens somewhere in the country pretty much every day. They obviously do not have to wait until a crime is actually committed, the active offence is committed, before acting. If they knew an armed robbery was about to take place from intelligence received, they don't have to wait until that armed robbery is taking place before acting, and the same applies here. Does the Minister agree with me that the police did an excellent job in very difficult circumstances, and this is a government that supports the police? We will leave the opposition parties to support those who do not follow the law. And the fact of the matter is, in extremely difficult circumstances, they did a good job.
Oh, can I just remind you, you're not at the bar now. You've got shorter questions. Come on, Minister.
Look, I thank my right honourable and learned friend for his question. Yes, I do agree the police did a good job in what were very difficult, fast-moving circumstances where judgments were inevitably difficult. It is easy to criticise after the event, but I think the police did a good job in what were extremely trying and difficult circumstances.
SNP spokesperson Anderson to
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The UN Commissioner for Human Rights has said that the Public Order Act is incompatible with the right to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and association. It is deeply disappointing to hear Labour and the Conservatives now both wedded to this legislation that undermines our right to protest. Graham Smith, the CEO of Republic, has said that these arrests are a direct attack on our democracy and the fundamental rights of every person in the country. He further says the right to protest peacefully in the UK no longer exists. Instead, we have a freedom to protest that is contingent on the political decisions made by ministers and senior police officers. That is entirely unacceptable. And in reading Sir Mark Rowley's statement that he has put out, he says, having reviewed the evidence and potential lines of inquiry, we do not judge that we will be able to prove criminal intent beyond all reasonable doubt. So these arrests were not necessary. And further, Sir Mark Rowley says he supports the officers' actions in this unique, fast-moving operational context, which means that if similar circumstances occurred, there is no certainty that this would not just happen again. So will the Minister tell me further what protections people can expect when they, in good faith, engage with authorities before protests to prevent this kind of thing happening, to find it happen again? And is he concerned that a journalist was amongst those arrested?
Well, it is entirely inaccurate to say the right to protest does not exist. As I pointed out, hundreds and hundreds of people did peacefully and lawfully protest on Coronation Day. They did so unmolested and unimpeded, which I think goes to show this idea that the right to protest doesn't exist, it doesn't exist anymore, is absolute nonsense. What does not exist is the right to cause disruption to other members of society. That is what our laws seek to prevent. And in relation to the Human Rights Act, and particularly Articles 10 and 11 of the ECHR, the recent Public Order Act had a Section 19(1)A statement on the front of it, saying that legal analysis finds it is compatible. And if the Honourable Lady studies Articles 10 and 11, and particularly the second paragraphs of those, she will see they are balanced rights, balanced with the qualified rights, which are able to be balanced against the right of democratically elected legislatures to legislate to prevent criminal activity, including disruption.
James Dale.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that the Metropolitan Police did a great job here? They took the necessary action to protect the public during a unique state event, and not one word of what we've heard opposite or anything that's going to come will be able to give any evidence to the country in respect of that. It is reassuring that for once the Metropolitan Police acts on the side of the hard-working public who want to have the opportunity to enjoy events rather than being the victims of left-wing protest groups.
I agree with my honourable friend.
Chair of the Select Committee, Dame Diana Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, and can I add my thanks to those involved in the arrangements for the coronation and keeping the public safe. However, I think the Home Affairs Select Committee will no doubt want to look at the policing of protests at the coronation, and in particular the specific provisions in the Public Order Act brought in just last week and used to arrest members of Republic. We've heard a lot about operational independence of the police this afternoon, so can the Minister just explain why the Home Office's Police Powers Unit on the 27th of April sent an official letter to Republic ahead of the coronation? Now, of course, Republic have no history of locking on. I just want to know how many other organisations received these letters, what other groups received them, and on what basis they were sent these letters, and whether this practice will now be the norm for the Home Office.
Minister.
Well, any such letters, I don't believe, were sent in my name, so I can't comment on who may have received them. I suspect, although I'm not certain, that these related to clarifying the new statutory provisions that were recently brought into effect through the Public Order Act 2023. The operational independence of the police is important because Parliament legislates, and it is then for the police to apply those laws without fear or favour, and they did so on this occasion.
Sir Desmond Swain.
There's been a misunderstanding, clearly. Despite the police doing a brilliant job, that's why there's been an apology. But wouldn't the Minister expect that misunderstanding to have been resolved well within the 16 hours for which the 6 were incarcerated? And surely there should be some questions asked about that.
Well, again, exactly what happened is an operational matter for the police. Clearly, on that day, Saturday just gone, the police had a lot going on in central London, policing the largest public event that we have ever had in our country's history. I don't know, and in fact no member of this House knows or can know precisely what inquiries were being undertaken while the decision ultimately to release those individuals was taken. But of course there are complaint processes available. If any individual member of the public wants to follow them, they're available to anyone who is arrested or indeed who encounters the police. And if someone feels the police have behaved in a particular situation unreasonably, they are able to use those complaint procedures.
Richard Berger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Isn't it the case that the arrests we saw of peaceful protesters at the weekend weren't an aberration, but were exactly what the Public Order Act is designed to do, to clamp down on legitimate peaceful protest, which should be a basic democratic right in this country?
No, that is not the purpose of the Public Order Act. The Public Order Act is designed to prevent people deliberately disrupting the daily lives of their fellow citizens, which we have seen with locking on public highways, causing enormous traffic jams, stopping people getting to hospital, stopping people getting their children to school, people being unable to get to work. We've seen 10-mile tailbacks on the M25, and we had specific intelligence that people planned to disrupt the coronation by creating a stampede of horses and covering the ceremonial procession